Finally tonight, we're taught at a young age to always consider both sides of the story. It's thought of as the golden rule of journalism, with networks like Fox News boasting about being fair and balanced. But a new book aims to change that standard, arguing that it forces the media into making false equivalencies, and that leads to bad journalism. The book is called Informing the News: The Need for Knowledge-Based Journalism, and its author is here tonight. Thomas Patterson is a professor of government and the press at the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Tom.
Emily.
Pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
So I love the book, of course. But you write about how there is such vast quantities of information out there right now, which is good in some ways. It's, you don't have to wait.
It's terrific on some level, yeah.
But so much of it is vastly unreliable. And how did it come to that?
Well, I think it was almost inevitable once you started to open up the possibilities. At one time, the news media pretty much dominated what we were going to see and hear, and then cable comes along, the internet comes along, and the price of entry was lowered greatly. It's not quite free, but if you're a blogger, it's almost free to join the chorus. And I think once you started to do that, make it, and then everyone's looking for audience. And there are ways other than the traditional way of informing people to attract audience. You can attract audience by being outrageous.
Now, do you blame journalists themselves? I mean, you write about informing the news, that journalists have to reach another standard. They need to be more informed about things. I mean, we've seen this in economics, in business, in environment, that they were sort of Renaissance men, but masters of nothing. But they need to be more knowledge-based.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are different today. One is that journalists, to some degree, have always depended on their sources. But I think the sources are engaged more likely now in spin. PR is everywhere. Journalists have to, in some ways, know the topic enough to kind of fend off the false realities that are often presented to them. And then the other thing is public policy and public life generally have become a lot more complex. Walter Pincus from the Washington Post said recently that he was hard-pressed to think of a journalist who really understood education policy. But if you don't understand education policy, how do you report deeply on it? And it's something that's extremely important to us as a society, and it's an area where we need good information, and in those areas we need journalists who are well-trained and understand the subject.
So in 1987, the Federal Communications Commission rescinded the Fairness Doctrine, and for people who don't know what that was, it required equal time, especially during political season. If you were going to bring somebody on for one position, you had to hear the other. You're not advocating to go back there, are you?
Well, I don't think we can go back there. What I think is happening is that there are lots of alternatives available to people. And what we need in that real mix that the media system is today, we need a place where people can go and predictably get relevant and trustworthy information about public affairs. And there's no one better positioned to do that than the news media. And to do that well, I think journalists have to be better trained. I think it's never been a large part of the training of journalists. Journalists are taught to do interviews, taught to observe events, report on that. But increasingly, I think, to deal with their sources, to deal with the complexities of policy and the events that are surrounding us, they have to know more about those. Can I give you an example? Let me give you an example. This was before 9/11. We had Matt Storn, the former editor of the Boston Globe, at the center. And he went back and looked at the terrorist acts, the major ones that had occurred before 9/11. And you had journalists talking about, of course, the bombing of the USS Cole, the bombing of the 2 embassies in Africa in 1998, the first World Trade Center bombing. And what he found was that the reporting was pretty good about the facts of those events. But there was very little attempt to kind of connect the dots, to say, why is this happening? Why does this relate to religious and political and cultural differences between the United States and the Middle East? And what's this about international terrorism? Why does it seem to be a growing threat? And then 9/11 happens, and for the most part, journalists were kind of at a loss to tell us why it had happened. And part of that relates to not knowing enough to kind of connect the dots from those earlier events.
Yeah, but you also talked about relying on sources. The President of the United States and Secretary of State Colin Powell told us that Iraq had weapons of nuclear, destruction, so we believed that.
Well, and that's, you know, that's one of the risks of journalism is the dependence on sources, and sometimes the sources are telling you the story straight, sometimes not. But the more the journalist knows when they walk into a situation, if they have some understanding of the issue, then they're more likely to know whether they're getting it straight or not, and they can, in that single instance too, of course, they can say, no, that's not quite the way I understand it. They can hold the source more accountable if they understand it more deeply.
Tom, you've got a million of these examples in the book, too. I really enjoyed it. Forming the News. Thanks so much, Tom Patterson.
You're welcome, Emily.